Hi, Isaac.
Rabbi, good morning. It's great to see you.
Good morning. So very exciting to probably, I feel today might be the most famous line
Uh-huh.
in all the New Testament that's not specifically very Christian-y, right?
Interesting.
It's the line that I think a lot of people view as one of the most important lines in the New Testament. So let's get started. One verse.
Well, I'm intrigued to hear if you would if you see any plagiarism in this, or because again, this is a very this verse is so often quoted by both Christian and non-Christian sources. Anyway, I would love to hear. I can't wait here to hear your thoughts
Yeah,
on this.
let's try to figure it out.
The
Yeah.
Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 7, verse 12. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets.
Wow. Okay. Very meaningful. That is generally called the golden rule. This shows up, generally it's viewed as certain parallels in Leviticus, in Deuteronomy, in the Talmud, in rabbinic writings, in Buddhist tradition, in Hindu tradition, in every tradition has some form of the golden rule. So we want to discover what is its meaning in Matthew. What is it? How is it different than maybe what traditional Jews were thinking at the time? How was it taken from the Bible and other places? So let's start with how we always start, Isaac, with what does this mean to you?
So, what does this mean to me? I think again, as we said earlier, this it's the often quoted verse. It's frequently quoted without any context or without any spiritual context because it's so common to both Hinduism,
Oh,
Buddhism,
who needs
Christianity.
context?
It's there all over the place. So, what I want to throw this back to you is that it sounds like in this verse, Jesus is saying he's summarizing the entire law, the entire Torah, everything into just one verse, which seems on his face a bit. So what's
Are
the
you
big deal?
basing that on the second half of the verse? It says, "For
Yeah,
this is the law and the prophets."
yeah. So I read that to mean he's saying that this is a summary of the entire law and the prophets, which in a way is distilling the entire Torah or the Talmud to just these to just to something to so generic. It could apply, and so that to me goes, huh? Um, is there anything distinctive about this? But also, uh, intrigued to hear if you see any plagiarism or how do all these different strands of faith they come up with this common theme, with this common, um, almost common theme, common words. Um, so
So
looking
I guess
forward.
that also makes sense considering that the Sermon on the Mount will be finishing soon. Generally, we view what is seven, it's coming like 7:11 is probably the end of one section. Now 7:12 is getting to the almost the end of the sermon. So I feel that this could be viewed as a summation of the entire sermon. I feel that's what you're saying, and maybe a summation of all religion. So I feel like as a Jew, the first thing that you have to see, without even thinking about it, is the very, very, very famous story of Hillel. Hillel has a very famous story. It's one of four stories. And in the name of time, I'm just going to read you one of the stories because we don't need to go through all of them. But the story, I think, is probably one of the most famous stories in the Talmud. And I'll just read it to you. Let's get going. Where to start? Okay. Another time, a non-Jew, a Gentile, came before Shammai. Generally, Shammai is viewed as the other rabbi with Hillel, and we a lot of times contrast their two personalities. He said to him, the non-Jew said to Shammai, "I will convert on condition that you teach me the Torah, the entire Torah, while I stand on one leg." Some people point out that one leg might be a Greek pun, that you have to teach me in one law. Some in English, we even understand one leg means, quickly. But
Mhm.
in short, it was both kind of egregious, the kind
Mhm.
of the things that the Shammai, a little chutzpahdik, a
Mhm.
little bit like, hi, I want to be a microbiologist. I want to be a physicist. Teach it to me in 5 seconds. So,
Well,
and going to the main person, one of the top two
yeah.
rabbis in the world. Okay, so what's
So
Shammai
Rabbi,
do? Yeah.
so Rabbi, this sounds like Twitter or X, right? Distill all of this into 140 characters. Take your complex ideas and distill all of this into 140
Right,
characters.
but when you do it on Twitter, or X, you're doing it in a way that you choose to write it. Someone else doesn't tell you to do it. So anyways, you have this guy, a non-Jew, says, I want to be part of your team. I want to convert, but I'm really not willing to do anything. Teach it to me in one leg. So Shammai drove him away with the builder's cubit that was in his hand, chased him away like, was crazy. So the man didn't give up. The convert, the wannabe convert came before Hillel, the nicer of the two in general perspective. He converted him on the spot. No questions asked. A lot of times you hear stories that Jews turn away non-Jews at least 3 times. Not Hillel. Hillel went away. He said to him, that which is, and when he converted him, he said, that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. That is the entire Torah. The rest of it is commentary. So go and learn it. So generally, people, when they read Matthew 7:12, they immediately parallel to the story. Hillel is actually a contemporary of Jesus. They literally are living at the exact same time. They say very, very similar stories. The difference being that Jesus was saying it to, I don't know if you want to call them wannabe converts, people who are part of his flock, people who are maybe not part of his flock, however you want to say. And Hillel was saying it to a convert. He immediately accepted him into the team. And then everyone points out that if Matthew 7:12 is the golden rule, people call what Hillel says the silver rule, the negative construct of the positive rule. What's interesting is that where did Jesus get it from? Generally, most people will look at Leviticus and Hillel for that matter. We'll look at Leviticus 18:19. Leviticus 18:19 says, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against members of your people. Love your fellow as yourself. I am God. And very, very famous, a lot of songs are using love your fellow as yourself. So a little different. A lot of times when Judaism, especially when the Bible says love, a lot of times it does have a action kind of perspective. It doesn't mean like, think emotionally about the person. It could mean that, but a lot of times it means act in a way that shows love. So most people look at Leviticus 18:19 as the root of both Jesus's teaching and Hillel's teaching, though it is funny that in Leviticus 18:19, the perspective is, you shall not take vengeance or bear grudge against your neighbor, and therefore you shall love. So it's almost like, it's not that you should love, you should realize that when people wrong you, you shouldn't continue to get back at them. It's almost a lack of response. It's almost like if this should be the root of turn the other cheek more, that we see later on, where we see in Luke 6:29, says turn the other cheek. And I feel like this verse is generally viewed as more of a root for Luke 6:29, but generally people look at Jesus and Matthew being the root for that. What's interesting is when I looked this up, the verse, I'm not in my regular space, so I looked it up on Sepharia, and Sepharia adds actually a word. I just want to read this to you because I think you'll laugh. It says, love your fellow, and then in brackets, it says, Israelite, as yourself. So Isaac, the reason it says Israelite is because for sure that's the context. But it's unnecessary, right? You don't have to make it that it is ethnocentric, because I think the reason that Matthew 7:12 is so special is not because of the words. And the reason that it is subversive and countercultural for that time is for something that may not even be in the text. When the verse says, in everything do as you do to others as you want to have them do to you, it definitely parallels Leviticus 18:19, but where Sepharia adds the word, your Israelite, here I think there's the golden rule that applies to all religions. It's viewed as a little bit subversive because Jesus, it seems, is saying a anti-ethnocentrism. It's not that you should do to others, Jews, Israelites, as you want other Jews, Israelites to do to you. Jesus is saying, if you're walking down the street and you see a person, you should treat that person politely, kindly, sensitively, because that's how you want it done. So it's not actually in the words. You could argue that the Matthew 7:12 is just as ethnocentric as Leviticus 18:19, but historically, Christians definitely don't read it that way. And this is the conversation we had. Is Jesus speaking to first century Jews? Is he speaking to the people in the kingdom of heaven? We just saw, like in our last conversation, where he says literally the verse before, if you then who are evil, which it makes it sound like these people are not quite in the kingdom of heaven. It makes it sound like maybe you don't want such a ubiquitous, universal kind of ethnocentrism. Unclear. But I think the reason this is called golden rule is because it is viewed as a subversive, anti-ethnocentric value that Jesus is trying to promulgate, even though it may not be in the words.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a good observation, right? So you're saying that these verses have a basis in the Talmud, but it's not ethnocentric, or it's not focused upon
Well, Hillel, I'm
yeah.
saying the verse has its roots. So Christian tradition views it as ubiquitous. What Jesus meant, I know we don't know. But when we look at Hillel, who did Hillel say it to? Hillel didn't say it to a random person on the street. Hillel said, convert the guy, whatever that means. In Judaism, usually convert means you jump into a ritualarium, a mikvah, you dip the person is, you nip the tip, you have a circumcision, and then you're Jewish. So it's a story, so it's not going into the details. It really just wants to get out the point. Don't do to others. So I guess the first question that we need to really answer is, what's the difference between what Hillel is saying and the contemporary of Jesus, who constructs it in a negative, versus what Jesus is saying, who more parallels what it says in Leviticus 19:18? What is the difference between a positive versus negative construct?
A great question, but also kind of building on that, right? So it's a very broad rule. It's more in line with verses 7 to 11, where he speaks in broad principles. Ask and shall be given, seek and you will find. Similarly, do whatever you wish others would do unto you, but not to them. Do you see any themes do you see commonality themes between the broad principles Jesus is making across these statements, across these verses from 7 onwards?
I mean, it's the next line on the sermon. So, if we wanted to hyper focus on, one thing we really didn't do is if you look at the sermon before, like the last section on, 7:7 to 7:11 was on God answering prayers. 7:6 was on, profaning the holy. 7:1 through 5 was on judging. We definitely could have tried to figure out the order of why would Jesus talk about serving two masters, then anxiety, then judging. We didn't do that for the most part. I feel that would be like another level of sermon construction, psychology, the sociology, sociologically would have made sense at that time period. So it's very hard when you see people, like if you look at Exodus and Parsha Mishpatim, that's like I guess in the 20s chapter, it has a bunch of rules in order right next to each other, and it has in Deuteronomy as well. And one of the things that Rashi, the medieval commentary from the 11th century, one thing he always points out is like, why is this line of the Bible next to that line of the Bible? And he'll almost always learn something special from that, something additional that the Bible doesn't say. But he'll say the reason that the rule of taking a wife at war is next to the rule of having two wives and one hated, one loved, is to teach you that if you have a loved and hated wife, you're going to have a kid that's unloved because that's chosen at war. They always try to make that connection, or I'll give you a bunch of examples. But the point is, we don't do that, I think, in the New Testament as much. I'm sure, like, if you wanted to, you could. It'd be like a whole nother study.
How about this, right? So 7:11, 7 to 11 spoke about ask, you shall give, and he's not speaking about things on this earth. Like he keeps saying, you have to keep asking, he'll give what we want. And also on the good things, he was speaking about the Holy Spirit, what we left last time. And so to your point about why is 7:12 in the positive sense, while Hillel was in the
so what's the difference?
In the negative sense, could it be that he's making a connection between 11 and 12, saying, you want to do positive, and I've already told you that you need God's help to do that. You have to ask that doing something positive takes effort, right? So it takes effort of a certain kind. Like you have to.
It takes effort to not do something negative. I try not to murder every day, Isaac.
Well, so trying not.
I'm not always successful.
Yeah. So trying not to murder, right? So that's more of as an I don't think about that, but as in that's avoiding something to versus doing something. As in, so if you say that, I didn't want to murder them, but I went out of my way to help them. That act of reaching out, helping to someone you don't like, it takes more effort than suppressing
I agree with you. So let me go now. So let's say you're right. This is more proactive. This is more sensitive. This tells you that you have a prescriptive action that you have to do, as opposed to Hillel, which is more proscriptive. It's more abstaining, refraining, keeping away from things. So let's go next level. Why would Jesus want to be prescriptive, and why would Hillel want to be proscriptive?
That's a great question. So this is where I think I see commonality between 7, 11 to 12, where seven is ask, it's all proactive, as in you want to do something, you're seeking something. We spoke about seeking as in clarity, as in having insights. And so this act of doing, so I see commonality between 7, 12, building on the previous themes, where he speaks about you need God, like God the Father gives you all these good things, and you have all these things of clarity, of having mental clarity or insight. And so all of that leads up to 12, where you want to be proactive. So I don't quite see this as being distinctive from the other phrases of other verses, more as in it builds on those. The other verses are more implicit, as in this work of proactive help needs it needs effort. But the work of suppressing something, it's a different type of effort. It's just suppressing what's already there. It's not as having to do something. It's just not doing something.
Okay.
I don't have a clear answer to your question as to why the Hillel, or what's the distinction. I would love to hear what you have to say on this.
I mean, I'm not sure either. It's interesting. Most people want, like, there's a problem inherent in do to others as you want to do yourself, right? There's a couple problems. Let's point out the problems, and maybe that'll help clarify the Hillel point. First problem. Do you think Jesus lives up to this? Jesus, the caller of vipers. Jesus, the caller of people who are evil. Jesus, who let's be honest, Jesus is like a go-getter. He does things that when he throws tables over, he angers people. And I feel that Jesus's attitude, a lot of times the historical Jesus that we see in the New Testament is not a lot of times the fully altruistic kind of sensitive person that we imagine him to be. And I think that if you said to Jesus, do you always do to others as you want done to yourself? He'd be like, no, I do to others what they deserve and what they need and what God wants of them. I feel Jesus, if you're hard pressed, I understand why it's in a sermon, and I'm not saying there's this cognitive dissonance between what he's saying and how he acts. I'm just noting that he does not do this in a way that we would feel comfortable saying that he's not the paragon of Jesus is not the paragon of 712. No one goes to Jesus and goes, he does exactly what he does is what he'd want done for himself. He doesn't want to be, he doesn't want to be called names. I mean, right? I mean, so that's one question that we have. Second question we have, what if the person's a sinner? This is a very famous question. What if the person's a masochist? I think of A Little Shop of Horrors, and you have the dentist who loves pain, a sadist, a masochist. So if that person wants pain, should everything you do to others as you want done to you, if I want pain done to me, or if I love sinning, or I love cheating, should other people do that to me? Like, is that what he's really saying? Like, I feel like, no way. So it's not really a ubiquitous rule. It should say, in everything you do to others, as you would have them done unto you, when that makes sense.
So to contract that, is that why it says, but this is the law and the prophets, as in, like, do to them.
I'm not even there yet, Isaac. I'm not even up to the law and prophets. I'm saying, like, putting that aside, like when we saw in Leviticus 19:18, love your fellow as you love yourself, the context was you don't want people to hold things against you with grudge. Don't hold a grudge. And I think when we make this one line, love your fellow as yourself, and we expand it, it doesn't make sense in a lot of cases. A lot of things, like, you don't want to be treated that way. And if anything, when we think of, let's say you're a good person and you want to be treated as you treat other people. So even in like psychology today, we differentiate, we bifurcate the top. There's self-love, right? And if you go to a mental health or a counseling center, they say, Isaac, where's your anxiety level? Do you feel comfortable? Do you have a level of self-love? But then I think we break self-love into there's self-interested self-love, which is jerky, insensitive, mean, conniving, manipulative. And then there is self-love that is positive psychology. You have self-esteem, you care, you know how to treat other people. So even when you view self-love and you insert it into Matthew 7:12, I'd say the self-love that's self-interested is horrible. It's anathema, we want to stay away from it. And the self-love that's based on a positive self-esteem and building self-love is something that we want to encourage. So this line is problematic. That's what I'm noting. The line is not only is it difficult to implement, the ambiguity in it, how it's hard, but when you look in the mirror and you see yourself, most people don't really want to be treated in the way that this is formulated. So I think this opens up the line about what you do. A lot of times, I think even people, when they look at Kant, they would say, like, Kant, like, let me give you a Kantian example. When people look at Kant and they say, you try to have a morality that's ubiquitous, that applies to everyone, but they point out that, like, what happens if I need a car ride, and Isaac needs a car ride, and Isaac's mother needs a car ride. Who should be taken? Morality, this can't be the foundation of morality, because it doesn't really tell you what to do in enough circumstances. A lot of times the legalism of Judaism is a response to the ambiguity of a moral relativism that is just not clear of what to do. A lot of times, what does a Jew do when he wakes up? A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And a lot of times when you talk to like a classic Protestant, you say, what do you do when you wake up? It's a little less, like, definitely more unclear than a Catholic, but like it's infinitely less clear than a Jew. And I think to try to fill in those spaces, if you fill in, like, your foundational document is 7:12, do to others as you want done to you, it's probably not strong enough for most people. And again, I'm not saying this is why Hillel flips it and does negative, but I think one of the things that Hillel does by making it negative, it's not really a foundational document anymore. Don't do this. This is what you should realize. There's a certain sensitivity you should have. And it could be that when we stick back that conversation into the convert story, it could be for him, this is just, if someone wants to be a convert, the number one thing you have to know is that you have to understand interpersonal relationships. You have to understand how to do that. But then don't forget that the ending line of the Hillel story is not that this is foundational. The ending line of the Hillel story is probably the opposite of what Jesus is saying. He goes, convert, don't do that hateful, and then he goes, now go and learn. He's saying, this is point A. I think a lot of times when Christians or other people learn 7:12, they learn the golden rule as point Z. This is the last point. For Hillel, without exception, there's no doubt that this is point A. This is the first thing that you need to know, and now you have to go learn everything else, because you got to understand interpersonal relationships. You got to know how to talk to people. But after that, you got to know how to put your tzitzis on, how to put your phylacteries on, how to pray, how to bring offerings out. Like, this is not enough. So I think Jesus and Hillel, ironically, are saying opposite things when they say the same exact thing. Jesus, at least the way Christians understand it historically, is saying this is a foundational rule, and Hillel is saying this is the foundation in order to get everything else in, but it's not foundational to know how to act.
That's a great observation. Yeah, thank you. So I was kind of reminded of the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, right? And
and when we say in Judaism, when someone that famous, I'm so used to hear we say, like, Zichron lebracha, a blessed memory, or we say in Hebrew means like may his memory be blessed. It's so funny when I hear someone that famous and I don't hear that extra appellation at the end. I'm like, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs III, knighted on this day of blessed memory. I feel like I'm so used to hearing some extra appellations. Anyways, go on.
I'll have to work on all this on his title. So, in his book Dignity in Difference, where he speaks on it's been a while since I've read this book.
Isaac, you haven't memorized the book? Gotta get on that.
So was this verse, this thinking, or this golden rule thinking, right? It comes in different forms. Do you see connections between how this would have shaped his thinking? Now, because if this would have shaped Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs' thinking, I would imagine that it's probably shaped Maimonides and all the other rabbis had also picked up on this. Do you see connections?
So the thing is, like, in Judaism, at least, the Bible is definitely shaping things, and the Talmud, at least, this is what we call in English translated as a story. Stories are more meant to teach values and not like, I think, shape as much. They're like, I guess a good way to say it is that it's part of the conversation. So obviously my mom is, obviously Rabbi Sachs would be aware of the story. But I even, as I mentioned, this story is a story that's part of 4 stories. It's part of a stories around converts. The focus is probably not even on that narrative. The story is actually focused probably on the non-Jew. That the other stories after that, the immediate line after go and learn it is another time another non-Jew was passing behind the academy, and the story immediately before that, one Gentile came before Shammai and said how many, and we had a whole conversation. So these are non-Jews who interacted with our top rabbinic sages stories. So I feel like that even the silver rule, as I called it, is viewed as like somewhat secondary to the value. So I'd say yes, it's part of the shaping, but it's not meaningful in the way that a Christian. But 1 second. The reason it's not meaningful, say why is it not meaningful? The reason is because the second half of the verse, which we didn't talk about, second half of the verse says, "For this is the law and the prophets." One way to read that, which the way you read it, which I think is accurate, is like I am summarizing Judaism, or I'm summarizing the way to get into the kingdom of heaven. If that is the summary, then you could throw away all legalism. You and I both know in Matthew, where we do have, it is the most Jewish of the 4 gospels, and it definitely has a lot, the most I think bilateral conversation with the Jewish public, especially obviously in comparison to John, but definitely in comparison to the synoptics. Even when you do a point-by-point comparison of Mark or Luke, you see that there's like probably more Jewish content. So this line, it's a complicated line when it says, "For this is the law of prophets." If it's a summary, that would be also, I think, a anachronistic read, because if it is a summary, it's saying that you don't have to do legalisms, and I don't view Matthew as a book that they're willing to throw away with the legalisms yet. I think that the kind of Pauline Christianity that we see later on is when it's superimposed into Matthew, I don't think it's always like the best read. So if this did mean, as you're saying, a summary, this is law and prophets, then I think then it makes sense the way that Christianity saw it as foundational. But in the synoptic parallel in Luke, where it says Luke 6:31, it just do to others as you have done to you would have them done to you. It doesn't have this is the law and the prophets.
So Rabbi. So I think so. You mentioned that because Jesus viewed this as foundational, as in, like, to your point, maybe this is C.
I'm saying Christians view this as foundational,
Foundational.
rule, and I said like we can't tell how Jesus used it, especially when we see the gospel parallel, and especially when we see that he didn't live by this totally. Which I think
to kind of build on that, right? So in the earlier verses and the ones we've seen so far, there's a strong premium on action as in doing the right thing. We spoke about love, not so much the touchy-feely thing, but doing the thing that needs to happen. So it's foundational in the sense that any act of love, that this forms a basis of loving action. Do you see any connections as to to do loving action even when it's difficult? You do
well, as I just said, that as we said before, it's based on the verse in Leviticus, which is love your neighbor as you love yourself, or as yourself. So number one, but yeah, I feel like it's broad. Love, give money, cheer on, be positive. Like you could put in any verb that you want into Matthew, and instead of saying do or do, love others as you want to love yourself. Give charity to others as you want charity to yourself. Feed others as you want others to feed you. So you could put in any verb you want, and I think it would be it fit, and that'd be fine.
So do you think back in the day, Jesus and the Hillel who did the other verse, that they would have had an open debate, open conversation on these different verses, and kind of how would that have gone if in the time they had a debate, a discussion, and how the ideas might have evolved?
Well, I'm going to throw it back at you. So that there's the short answer of we see what Jesus did in the Gospels, right? And we see what kind of interactions had. The broader question is, we know that when we look at the historical time period, there definitely were multiple groups of Jewish people, aside from the Sadducees, aside from the Pharisees, aside from the rabbis, aside from the Essenes, aside from the Dead Sea Scroll people. There's a ton of people floating around, and they obviously had inter-religious dialogue. On top of that, we see that pagans would have conversations with Jews a lot of times. So would Hillel and Jesus had a debate? So that's a great question. I would say that what the story of Hillel and this story seem to come out of the same rubric, same ambiance. You know, a lot of times the story is in the Talmud. We don't know when they're written, and we don't know what influenced them. So you know, I can't tell you exactly what Hillel said or did at any time period. And, you know, finding the historical Jesus has parallels in finding the historical Hillel and finding historical Rabbi Akiva. I think Hillel and Rabbi Akiva are such important rabbinic figures that they're foundational in rabbinic Judaism. In the Judaism that I keep, you're right for this. I know this doesn't sound funny if you didn't know this. Orthodox Jews follow the Judaism of Hillel as understood by Rabbi Akiva. And think about that, like these guys were monuments. These guys are the two guys on our Mount Rushmore, where your Mount Rushmore might be Jesus and again, I don't know who else is on at yours, Isaac, but mine would be like Hillel, Rebbe Kiva, Maimonides, and then like maybe like you know, some Polish guy, so I feel good about myself, you know. But that's our Mount Rushmore. So for you, it's unclear what conversations they had, but it wouldn't be impossible to say that Jesus met Hillel. That wouldn't be impossible. It wouldn't be impossible to say that Jesus, when he went to churches and spoke on Saturdays, would have been something that Hillel would have done as well. And it wouldn't be impossible to believe Hillel actually was originally Babylonian. You know, he moved to Israel. You know, they could have had different kind of Aramaic conversations. They could have had they would have had different somewhat traditions. The Babylonian Judaism would have been a little bit different. And when he came over, Hillel would have had to integrate it. Okay, so the answer is we don't know, but they're in the same cultural context.
Well, this answers a big question for me. And I've seen the word Hillel multiple times. So we have, it's called Hillel of this. The word Hillel is commonly used to name organizations. I didn't know it's named after a person.
It's the guy. Hillel, and you know what, Shammai, you saw his co-conspirator, Shammai, gets no schools. It's one of the jokes in the Jewish world. Shammai is so important too, but gets no schools. Hillel, my day school that I went to for all of elementary school and high school was Hillel. And then before I worked here, I worked at an organization called Hillel. Hillel, like I've spent most of my life, is that majority? Like at least half my life at organizations called Hillel.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Rabbi, thank you for this background. Thank you for Matthew 7.
Yeah. Okay.
We get to see a debate between Hillel and Jesus.
Yeah, we'll call it a day, Isaac. Okay. Great speaking.